Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrafil anbiya'i wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good morning to all. Welcome to this program, monthly lecture on Malay Manuscript, organized by ISTAC-IIUM with the cooperation and support by the Malaysian Historical Society. So the event today is in fact the second lecture in this program. The first lecture was held at the end of last January, delivered by our esteemed Professor Midori from Sophia University, Tokyo, on the topic about Malay manuscript and other local manuscripts that are available in Mindanao. So today is the second lecture in the series of lectures under this program. The topic for today, I feel is very interesting because not many people knows about the Malay manuscript available in South Africa, especially in the Cape Town area, whereby there are significant numbers of Malay resided there, and they moved to South Africa sometime in the 17th century from what the region that now we call Malaysia and Indonesia. And as the tradition in the past happened, Malays and other sub-ethnic group in Indonesia and Malaysia, when they write, normally they write in Jawi. I mean, it's Arabic script and using Jawi language or Malay language. The topic for today is Ajami or Melayu manuscript at the Cape, returning to the South Africa's literary scene. It will be delivered by the renowned scholar from South Africa, Professor Muhammed Haron. His interest on Malay manuscript is very well known. I personally remember when the National Library of Malaysia sent an officer to trace and catalog Malay manuscript in South Africa in the year 1996. There is the officer concerned was Madam Munazah Zakaria. He was sent to trace and catalog Malay manuscript in South Africa, and Prof. Muhammad Haron was the person that we contacted, and he was very helpful in making the trip successful. In fact, prior to this visit, Prof. Muhammad Haron came to Kuala Lumpur in 1984 to attend and deliver a paper on Malay manuscript in South Africa at the Conference of Malay Manuscript organized by the National Library of Malaysia. So I can say that among his many interests, his scholarly interests, one of them is definitely Malay manuscript in South Africa. A short note on the presenter, Muhammad Haron was attached to the University of Botswana's Theology and Religious Studies Department from 2000 to 2020 and was a professor of religious studies at the university from 2016 to 2020. He was formerly associated with the University of Western Cape, where he taught Arabic, and the University of Cape Town, where he taught Islamic studies. Currently, he is a senior researcher for the Cape Town-based Al-Jama'ah Party and an associate researcher at the University of Stellenbosch, South Africa. He has authored and edited more than 10 books and editor of a number of journals. Before I forget, I would like to inform that the session is planned for 2 hours, 1 hour for lecture session and another hour for question and answer session. All the questions should be written in the chat box of the Zoom and YouTube. And later I will read them for the lecturer or presenter to answer them. And now I am very pleased to invite Prof. Muhammad Haron to deliver his lecture on the topic Ajami or Malay Manuscripts at the Cape, returning to the South Africa's literary scene. Over to you, Prof. Thank you.
Okay, terima kasih Dr. Wan Ali, Wan Mamat for the introduction. First of all, I wish to express my heartfelt thanks to ISTAC, to Professor Bakar, to yourself, and all colleagues there for having invited me to join this particular forum. Secondly, I also just want to express my gratitude to some of my friends here in Afrika Selatan who had assisted with some of the material, Ibrahim Salih and Dr. Dokrat and others, who basically, of course, are also familiar with aspects of these. The topic that we are addressing this morning is an issue that had been tackled by a number of individuals, and we'll mention them as we go through this set of slides. Now, talking about this set of slides, as you will note as we go through the lecture, that we have quite a number of them. And this is partly because we try to cover all aspects as best as possible, but at the same time, we won't be able to do justice to each of them. So we'll try to focus on some and then fleetingly go through others. But those that we're going to focus on are the ones that I feel are critical and important to share with you. And this will be particularly towards the end and at the beginning. So let me start off by, I hope I can share the screen, Dr. Wan. Has that been permitted? Screen sharing to show my slides? I can't seem to, I wish to share my slides. They don't seem to appear on the system. I seem to have a technical problem this side. I'm not certain whether. Dr. Wana, are there any? Sorry. Let me. I have a technical problem. I don't know whether it is from my side or. Let me see.
I think it's okay.
There.
Yes.
There we are. Is it there now? Are you able to see my shared screen?
Yes, we can see.
Okay. All right. Sorry for the slight delay. Okay. Let me sort of just quickly give you a synopsis of what I wish to cover. I will look at the connection between Southeast Asia and Southern Africa, just locating it very briefly, socio-historically. Then we talk about the issue of language community as part of that theoretical frame. But this theoretical frame is extended into the notion of scholarship, which we will sort of speak about. Then I want to just focus a bit on the catalogs that have been compiled, because these are critical reference texts that nobody can sort of lose sight of when they want to revisit this particular area. And then we want to briefly talk about Sheikh Yusuf and Imam Abdullah Qadi Abdul Salam, who basically were pioneering figures. And then, of course, we look specifically at South Africa in terms of the Ajami manuscripts, and then giving samples of those, and then looking at the transition from Malay manuscripts to Arabic Afrikaans. So there are these important developments that we need to consider. Having said that, again, we're just sharing you those maps so that we can have a mental picture of the connection that basically exists between our sort of regions. Of course, we're part of the Indian Ocean Rim, so inevitably there has been connections historically. Archaeologists still need to do much more, and so do we expect from historians and geographers, because there has been movements between the two regions over the many centuries. But let me quickly come to the notion of scholarship. When we talk about this particular field, we talk about scholarship about Ajami texts, which is a very specific area, and not everybody has an interest in it, unfortunately, but the value of this is enormous, and we'll try to share some of those points as we move along. Scholars, basically, who are they? Well, they are theologians, they are jurists. Of course, in terms of the Arabic terms, they are the mutakallimun, or the fuqaha and so forth, who pen these, and they are the individuals who contributed towards the formation of Muslim thought at the Cape, and connect this with Southeast Asia in different ways, and we'll show that later. The other dimension is the scholarly outputs that exist. It started out as manuscripts, subsequently then as lithographic texts, and then thirdly as printed texts. Way back to I've worked on a bibliography on Muslim South Africa as a way of, again, giving researchers a tool to work with so that they know what had been published and what haven't been published. So in that way, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but you basically add to what they basically exist. Interesting to do, there was a text by Wan Hashim and Hanafi Dola quite a while ago on the Cape Muslims, as you can see from there. But let me sort of quickly read part of the abstract that I have, and then we will go through the other slides. Even though it has become widely known that South African Muslims, sorry for this, that South African Muslims' religious leadership contributed towards the development of South Africa's literary scene with its unique set of Cape, Ajami, Melayu literature during the 18th and 19th centuries, respectively. South Africa's specialists on literature continue to ignore this. And that's why we talk about reversing the literary scene, because this area is really, it's sort of marginalized. They have done so by not only treating it as an obscure, marginalized set of works, but they have also disregarded its exceptional value towards religion and culture that are key ingredients of communities residing in Southern Africa, as well as societies living in Southeast Asia. Despite this genre's deliberate sidelining by these European cum oriented scholars, a few such as Van Selms and Hans Keller realized its importance, and for this very reason, they wrote about them, and we'll come back to them in a moment. While some of these scholars made sterling efforts to catalog, like Haron and Haja Mohan Munazza, to comment on them, David Karan basically made their contribution, and to critique them is Keller himself and Kies Versteeg from Holland. There were others who chose to translate these texts. And one interesting publication that came into the book market in 2019, but because of COVID, unfortunately, things were scuttled, is this particular book on the book cover, as you see on your right, Spiritual Path, Spiritual Reality, Selected Writing of Sheikh Yusuf. And this is the first time that the collection of Sheikh Yusuf's writings have been made available in English. So I think it's a contribution that we need to visit. And my argument has been that it should have been published in Southeast Asia instead of maybe by UNISA Press, that basically is not sharing it as it should. But be that as it may, I also felt that there should have been effort to those manuscripts translated into Bahasa, because the value, of course, it's in Arabic, because all Sheikh Yusuf's works are in Arabic. So that, in any case, that's just aside the issue, but it's important. Let me come to the other part of the abstract. The outcome of these studies demonstrated that this unique genre of literature cannot be ignored, and that they must be recorded, studied, and written in a significant contribution towards world literature in general, and as part of South Africa's literature in particular, and perhaps one can say Southeast Asian literature as well. That said, it should not be forgotten that some historic, and correctly so, belong to the literature that were written in and transported from Southeast Asia. So that is an important issue. Quickly, just to another footnote, is that this book has just come out, evaluating Sheikh Yusuf Makassar and Imam Abdullah Tidori's writings. We're waiting for the hard copies from Jakarta, but we just want to share that, but we'll come back to that if need be. The third part, the sort of leg of this abstract, is to link the absence or the presence, whichever way you want to describe it, of these to the development of Arabic Afrikaans manuscripts, which took place between 1840s, 1950s, and that complement the Malay manuscripts that landed at the Cape between 1700s and 1850s. Now, that in itself is a very interesting issue which haven't been explored, and that perhaps we will want to sort of talk about a bit more. A fourth is to undertake a brief comparative view of at least two Ajami manuscripts to not only establish the importance within the respective South African, South Asian literature scenes, but also to stress their value in Muslim thought and civilization. Now, as we said earlier on, language and community are two critical ingredients, two critical concepts that we need to explore. Now, bearing that in mind, Africa itself as a continent is a home of a plethora of Ajami manuscripts. When we say Ajami in a broad sense of the word, in a sense that it takes into consideration the word Makuakua, for example, Northern Mozambicans, they also wrote their manuscripts in their local language. The Fulanis in West Africa, they also wrote it in their language. And so we can go on the list, and these are two books that basically do so. Community languages established and imported. Again, we want to quickly just talk about those, that the Cape itself was a potpourri of communities. And so in a sense, people came with their own languages. They brought them when they were enslaved, when they were exiled. So in that sense, the issue of languages mix. And this is what we observe also in the manuscripts that we sort of find. Again, on the sort of notion of community contribution, the notion of Creolized linguistic culture emerged as we sort of move along. In other words, across the 2 or 3 centuries that as we look back, we find this sort of having taken place. And this in itself makes it a fascinating area for linguists, for language sort of translators and so forth, just to see the sort of the way the language grew, and how language itself, in this case Afrikaans, sort of emerged from 2 communities into what it is basically today. And of course, the Afrikaner community only acknowledged that of late, because they did not know that Afrikaans itself was written in that, but we'll come back to that point later. Again, the issue of language shape ethnic, religious, racial identities, and they reflect socio-cultural understandings, and they express religio-political ideological positions. So these are all mixed, as we know, into language, and language is a very sensitive sort of aspect of human, of communities for numerous reasons. We're not going to go into that. As we had already mentioned, during the VOC period, that is the Verenigd, the Dutch East India Company, when they were controlling South Asia, there was a pool of languages. And of course, when they were controlling the Cape, local language such as Sankhoi, the Bantu, and imported languages such as your Dutch, your Southeast Asian languages, and so forth, all were spoken at the Cape. By the 19th century, there was a shift in that. And then by the 20th century, we see this having shifted even further. But these are it just gives you us a basic idea. You may also conclude then with the point of language itself. Language policies, as you can see from this diagram, shifted. For example, from the 17th, 18th century, local language of Dutch, slaves and exiles, mother tongues. Then you move later, the Dutch becomes the dominant language, with local languages and exile language also being subservient, so to speak, to it. Then by the 19th century, we find English or the British taking over, Dutch becoming secondary. And now in the 20th century, we find, of course, a shift in that. Having said that, let me come to the other important theoretical frame. Talking about scholarship. Scholarship itself is a fascinating area that has developed into something that we all, those of in academia, have experienced. There are different dimensions of this. And I, again, go to Boyer, who has contributed quite interestingly on the subject, but we're not going to go into the points that he raised there. But I just want to share it with yourselves so that you understand that for us to engage with manuscripts itself, we need different people to come together, people from different disciplinary backgrounds. And this basically tells us why we are maybe, especially in language, we need somebody in history, we need somebody in geography, we need somebody, so in other words, we need transdisciplinary scholars, multidisciplinary scholars, because these manuscripts are so valuable, so important in terms of not just our identity of Muslims, but of communities, in terms of how they themselves transform themselves because of these manuscripts. And if it had not been for these, the argument goes, then we would not have been where we are, so to speak. In other words, they lay the necessary foundations for intellectual transformation and developments. So the scholars whom we had mentioned earlier on, who really played a critical role in this whole process, the first person to come to is Adrianus van Selms. Van Selms wrote a book entitled Arabic Afrikaans. I just translated Arabic Afrikaans, a catechismus, just trying to look for the English word, but so basically a two-language text. So he himself was among those scholars. Of course, he comes from Holland. He settled in South Africa, was a professor of Semitics at the University of South Africa, and he felt he needed to engage because he was quite surprised to find these, and he therefore contributed to it. The other person was Hans Keller, a German scholar who came on a trip, who was attached to one of the, I think to Hamburg, if I'm not mistaken, and he produced a very valuable piece of work compared to Van Selms in trying to identify many works in Arabic Afrikaans. So, of course, and some of these he also then realized were in Malayu. So he notes that in this particular text. So it's a very valuable text, which I think will be great to have been translated from German into English for wider audience or even in Bahasa. But unfortunately, it's out of print, but it's an extremely important text. One important individual whom we cannot miss in this whole discussion is Ahmad David. He was a social worker by training and then subsequently moved slowly into the academia. And he was amongst those who really explored this area in a very intellectual way. In other words, he tried to understand what made the Cape Muslims tick. And one of it was the language use, how they made use of this language, Afrikaans, how they creatively transformed Afrikaans itself. And this is how he made his mark. The two books that basically appear on our left-hand side, the one was edited by Professor Hein Willemse and Professor Suleiman Dango, where they collected all his ideas and basically put it in one text. And then the other one is an abridged version that appears in Afrikaans. So when we talk about manuscripts, a number of things that we can think about. Manuscript cross borders. They reach communities. They teach fundamentals. They mentor youth. They train leaders. In other words, the sort of quality or the credentials of a manuscript is much more than what meets the eye. And I think this becomes more and more important. I just take my cue from Perpustaka Negara's Malaysia's sort of definition. Malay manuscript as handwritten works in Jawi, script produced in the early 16th century to the early 20th century. Malay manuscripts are written on materials such as paper and so forth. We're not going to read everything. Knowledge recorded in Malay manuscript covers subjects such as literature, history, and so forth. And what we note when we consider this definition, it applies to what we find at the Cape. And that's the reason for making reference to that. So the Ajami scripted text is centuries old, as we all know, and it's found in Africa, it's found in sort of Southeast Asia. So there is a interesting, and of course, one would like to know whether Southeast Asia's influence is also found along the east coast of Africa, because even Swahili, as you know, was written in the Arabic script. And Makua, as we had said earlier on, which is just the southern part of Tanzania, northern part of Mozambique, where there's a community that is still there. Unfortunately, the community has been described as extremists and so forth, which is totally nonsense and bunkum, partly because they are a poor community and has never been given the necessary share of the wealth in that region. But that's a side issue. Just in terms of the subjects that have been covered, of course, I think I found this on Berita Harian's website, which just gave a synopsis of the type of themes that have been covered, from Quran, Tawheed to Fiqh and so forth. And so this is also what we basically came across. Interestingly, the Indonesian embassy in 2006 had a seminar where a few of us participated, and of course, trying to also grapple with the issue of manuscript at the Cape. Whilst that was indeed an important contribution, again, at that point or up to that point, there wasn't another catalog in sight that captured what Haja Munazza basically did. So Munazza's text remains a very critical piece in terms of research. However, before we come to the other catalog, let me quickly just say, what did she cover in her collection? She basically had Ahmad Davids, whom we referred to. He had 13. Maybe I should explain the numbers there. First of all, we counted about 70 manuscripts that she could identify that are part of these individuals' catalogs. Ahmad Davids basically, she listed 6, but then there's basically, if you look closely, she basically has 13 and not 6 as such. So it's double that number. There's a Muhammad Hilmi Hartley who had 4, Dr. Qasim Darcy who had 7, but essentially is 8, and so forth. A point which I just want to make now, but I'll come back to later, is that Dr. Darcy and the South African Cultural History Museum and Haji Hussein Alawi, each one of them have fascinating manuscripts where there's only one copy at the Cape, and that makes that copy extremely valuable. Now, we are not saying the others are not. What we are saying is that the mere fact that you only find one reflects or relates some idea, but we will come to those ideas a bit later. Then there's the Nur Haywood collection that had 10, and that differed from the catalog by Dr. Mukhlis Paeni from Indonesia, whose catalog again, maybe I should express my thanks to Dr. Syahril from Indonesia's University of Indonesia, who shared with me this scanned copy last week. So in a sense, I looked very late at this, but an interesting set of collectors that he was able to identify. Some of them are in the other catalog, but there are others names that only appear in this catalog, like your Zainab Davidson, your Yusuf Akhadin, Benjamin Kali, and Ibrahim Hassan. So I have gone through it, and basically as noted from the top, there are 114 manuscripts, but in one case, it's sort of one was appeared twice, so it's 113 manuscripts that Dr. Peony was able to identify. But we'll sort of come back to some of these. The important thing that one has to ask as one moves into this particular arena is, why has this Ajami tradition taken off at the Cape, for example? Who were the key figures? When did this process begin? What were the contents of these manuscripts? Which from among these are popular and which were less popular? And why we raise that question? Because we find some of these manuscripts appeared sort of, in other words, there are 8 copies, and that's quite a few. And what one would like to encourage future researchers who are able to identify and find these copies to compare them and to do a critical edition, because that's also very helpful, as we know from the scholarly arena, for those of us who are involved in manuscript writing, so not writing, but in editing, that in itself becomes an important volume then. Where were they copied? Lithographs, cyclostyle, all of these are important questions that sort of one grapples with. How do they manage to write these in challenging circumstances and so forth? Now, again, I come to another, all of these, in a sense, essentially are part of the knowledge production process. And for one as a researcher, not to overburden one with theoretical frames, but it's also helpful just to have knowledge production as part of that frame, because one has to understand who was the person who initiated the writing of the manuscript, and then who copied it, and for which target audience, and during which period. All of these are interrelated questions that I think are useful. And this is just repeating the previous slide. What is of interest, and which just before we basically officially started, when I spoke to Professor Bakar about this, is the issue of that many of these manuscripts are in the hands of families or individuals and families. They have not been collected and put in the museum or in the state library where they should be. And 2 reasons for this. 1, at least it is in safekeeping. 2, that they are preserved, conserved by the people who are familiar with manuscripts, because we know that they're brittle and they can disappear over time. And maybe a third too is that so that the family members don't fight over these. As you all know, that when they're in families, the one son or the one daughter or the cousin or the nephew would say, but that is mine. And we don't want people to fight over a valuable text that contributes to the identity of the community at large. And unfortunately, whatever is said is basically what we experience. Coming now more specifically to the Cape, what do we find? We find at the Cape, of course, Arabic was familiar amongst those theologians and jurists, those trained. But the manuscripts also reveal that some of them were written in Bugis, some in sort of Melayu, and some in Sundanese or one of the other local languages. Of course, not many, but the point of the matter is the mere fact that they are to be found is a reflection that all of these languages were pretty active at one stage in the history of the Cape Muslims. Now, I, in a sense, wanted to describe these as traveling manuscripts. And the reason for that is that many of them were not necessarily written at the Cape, particularly the Melayu texts. They were brought either with the exiles or with those who were enslaved. So, or maybe with others. But the point which we need to bear in mind that these were what one can describe as traveling, because they moved from one region to another region, and how they became valuable to those communities who were the receiving communities, who were basically now the new emerging community, how they were able to engage with these. So the emerging scholarly theological circles and information networks then basically emerged. And one of the key dimensions of all of these, and as you yourselves know in Southeast Asia, is tasawwuf, the Sufi orders. Sufi scholars had and continue to have a critical role, despite what we know in contemporary situation of the Wahhabi sort of approach to sort of Islam and understanding. I think our communities have moved far beyond that because of these Sufi scholars, and we can always talk about that again. The outcome of their interaction is the production of religious knowledge. They authored them, they copied them, circulated them, and this is basically what we find. Just to reinforce this idea of copiers and authors, and for the Cape, and now that one looks back, these manuscripts have helped to shape the Cape Muslim intellectual outlook in a subtle way, not in a very visible way, in a very open, tangible way, but in a subtle way, partly because the manuscript came not at one go to the Cape, they came over time. And over time, we find that people develop their thinking based upon this, and we'll sort of come to those when we look at the examples of the manuscript. And as you all know, that these are the sort of various themes within the sort of manuscript tradition, the Siyat, the Hikayat, Dini, Risalat, and Tib, and so forth. Now, those are to be found at the Cape too. Now, but let me get back to Southeast Asia in a sense, and why is this so necessary? Because we cannot understand what happens at the Cape without having a knowledge of what happens in Southeast Asia. So what happened in Southeast Asia? As you all know, Sheikh Yusuf was exiled to the Cape. The question is, did he write his manuscript at the Cape? The response is, no, he did not, which meant that he wrote all his manuscripts whilst he was back in South Asia. So that is the one. Palembani's texts are to be found at the Cape. How did it arrive here is the question. So we will come to that again. But interestingly, all the scholars that have made an impact via Al-Makasri, via Al-Palembani, and Fansuri and others, people like Samarkandi, people like Al-Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, As-Sanusi. And it is fascinating when one looks at these individuals. And just a quick footnote, in sort of more than 20 years ago, I did a text on Samarkandi without having realized that he had a manuscript that was translated into Afrikaans at the Cape. So what does this tell us? And of course, as you can see, he's 10th century scholar, pretty old compared to others who come later. And so the impact of these, of Samarkandi, was indeed, in a sense, enormous for the small community that was here. And now, leaving that aside, let me sort of just quickly then move on. Now, when one talks about intellectual development and lineage, I think we cannot rule out, we should not overlook the interconnectedness of scholars and how these scholars' ideas traveled to South Africa. We're all familiar with Aranri, we're all familiar with Al-Qurani and their students. And of course, there's debates, when one looks at Professor Azra Azumardi's text, very, very interesting sort of work that helps to connect all of these networks, how maybe Ranri's influenced Sheikh Yusuf, but then some say that Sinkili was not necessarily a student, but some of his ideas might have trickled down. But he was, of course, a student of Qurani. But also interesting is their students. We know that there's, of course, I'm just trying to, if we look at Burhanuddin Ulakan, Al-Menkabawi, he himself has been involved in Sinkili's works, Tarjuman al-Mustafid, for example. And the question is, have these works found their way to the Cape? Interestingly, indeed they have. As-Sirat al-Mustaqim of Aranri has been found at the Cape. Mir'atul Tulab or Mir' al-Muhaqqiqin, of course, of Sheikh Yusuf have been found here. Tarjuman al-Mustafid, that one I'm not certain about because I haven't been able to closely look at the tafasir or those copies that are here, but I'm sure that there is a connection. So Ranri indeed is a figure, and his contribution found its way, and even Bustan Salatin that features here have been found at the Cape. So the question is, how come these basically are found here? Why? Of course, we have more questions than answers. Nonetheless, I think it's an interesting transference of knowledge, transference of ideas, sort of influencing ideas from Southeast Asia to the Cape, and how the Cape itself transformed itself because of Southeast Asia, that interconnection. So we all are familiar with the important knowledge centers, Banda Aceh, Palembang, Banjarmasin. All of these were important, and all of them in one way or another find the ideas filtering down or traveling across the ocean to the Cape. So we have, for example, important figures now. My friend Ibrahim Salih, who was an archivist and early Muslim historian who has been doing lots of fascinating work, can maybe fill us with many more names than the ones that we have here. But the point which I mentioned, why I mentioned him, is part because he has been able to identify a long list of others. And the reason why I'm mentioning it's partly to do with, have some of them not been bringing these manuscripts to the Cape? Have they not been carrying them, traveling with them? And so that could be the case, because some of the manuscripts that we have listed are not necessarily, didn't come with Tuang Nuruman, for example, or with Imam Abdullah of Tidore. So, but the point is that these manuscripts are there. We have, let me quickly just start with the 17th century. We all are familiar with, again, we mentioned that early on, Sheikh Yusuf al-Makassari was exiled here in 1694 and died in 1699. So he was here for a short period with family members. And as we had said early on, he did not write any of the manuscript here, but basically from outside, but these might have come along with him, or these might have been kept back there. But I think we're all familiar with his sort of many writings, and his sort of great-great-granddaughter, I don't know how to describe, but she, Munazza, Dr. Sahib has completed a thesis not very long ago through University of Africa, trying to reflect on the contribution of Sheikh Yusuf. But that aside, the text of Imam Abdullah is one of the most important local texts. In other words, At-Tidore was exiled to the Cape, and then he wrote these whilst he was imprisoned. And if one looks at this tome, it consists of various manuscripts. And one of them is Kashful Ikram, for example, a text that basically has formed part of his collection. But the title for his collection was known as Ma'rifatul Islam wal Iman, which is in fact only a part of it, but it's a useful word because of the overall understanding with Ma'rifah. Then, of course, we have 19th century, we have two important works. The text by Al-Qawl Mateen we'll come to in a moment, and then Abu Bakr Effendi's Bayanuddin, which was written, and both these texts have been written in Afrikaans. And so this is where the shift takes place from Malayu text to the Afrikaans text, and that is what we basically try to reflect in this diagram. When we take the Jawi, Ajami text, 17th, 18th century, they were essentially Malayu texts. But then the shift takes place in the 19th century, and of course by the 20th century, we have only Afrikaans texts. So there has been this sort of movement that we have to bear in mind. But let me come back and repeat to an extent which I'm doing the points made earlier. And that is, when you look at the 17th, 18th, 19th century in the diagram on our left, we have the following questions to ask. Who brought Araniri's As-Sirat al-Mustaqim to the Cape? Who has an interest in Akhbar al-Akhirah? Who had an interest in Dalail al-Khayrat of Imam Jazuli? What about Tuhfat al-Raghibin of al-Banjari? All of these found their way to the Cape. So why were they copied? for whom, how many were produced, and this is part of our sort of engagement, and to how many copies were there, and this is what we basically found some interesting results. As you can see, these are just selections of manuscripts that were in circulation at the Cape: your Kashf al-Ikram, your Kifayat al-Muhtaj, Sabil al-Muhtadin, As-Sirat al-Mustaqim, which we had already mentioned more than once. Important, again, just from a purely theoretical dimension, is that when we talk about traveling manuscripts, we have to bear in mind who the author was. We should, if we have knowledge about who the copyist was, and then have knowledge who the collector was. Unfortunately, both catalogs that we basically refer to do not talk about the background of each of these collectors. For me, as a researcher and interested in manuscript, just want to know, how did the collector, the owner, get hold of these? Because you can't just get hold of it, you know, from the sky. Somehow there must have been some interaction with somebody before them, or in their family, or some friend of theirs. So that is important. The other is, how did these manuscripts influence thinking at the Cape? The text itself, how did the teacher get hold of the text? And how did the person who was inducted, who was nurtured, who was mentored, who was guided, basically, how did he, or if there was she's who received this knowledge, how did they make use of this? So, that being the case, let me come to the most inspirational. I say most, partly because he was, of course, not the only one who exiled here, but because of his stature back in South Asia, being mujahid of sorts, but also a scholar at large, Sheikh Yusuf stands out. And of course, basically, his light continues to shine, so to speak, in our hearts, partly because of the contribution he had made. And as we had said early on, the two scholars edited a selection of his writings, and of course, contributed by a number of other scholars to basically give life, so to speak, to what he had written in English. So in other words, one get a sense when you read these texts in English, for those of us who are not able to read Arabic, at least as to what he covered, why he did, why he wrote what he did, and so forth. So Sheikh Yusuf is the one important personality. The other is Imam Abdullah ibn Qadi Abdul Salam from Tidore. And so these two lay the foundations of this emerging community that, and of course, we talk about emerging in that period, in the 18th century and into the 19th century. And then subsequently, we had other scholars, as the names that we see on our right. Many books have been written on Sheikh Yusuf by now. Myself and Dr. Wan Ali basically are busy sort of working on a bibliography, annotated bibliography on Sheikh Yusuf. And that, of course, we can always share at some other occasion. But we just want to underscore the fact that Sheikh Yusuf will become important focus of research, not only, of course, in Indonesia and Malaysia, but also here in South Africa. But I think lots of work have of late been done on him, as you can see from these texts. This is just part of my study. Of course, it's totally be changed, is the writings that have appeared over time in terms of the contributions that have been made on him and about him. This is a text, Asrar, which has been translated into English and into Bahasa, I think, from the text that you see from Angasunan and others. And then there's a text of commentary in Arabic by Sheikh Rahim Din Nawawi al-Bantani. I've been trying to get hold of the text, unfortunately I haven't, but because of the interest in Sheikh Yusuf, these basically stand out. Coming back to the book that I mentioned earlier, is this particular important compilation of translations. And so when one talks about, and I want to quickly just comment on the issue of translations before we sort of go on to this list that we have here. Many of the texts that we have, and I'm sure some of you might have the same experience, that these texts that were written either originally in Arabic were translated either into Bahasa, or in our case, they were translated into Afrikaans, but of course using the Arabic script. So it makes these scripts unique in the sense that they have a text in an Arabic script, but in a different language, whether it's Malayo, whether it is Bugis, whether it is Afrikaans. That is the one. Second thing is, these texts have also allowed the mere fact that you translate is also to a degree a way of interpretation, because sometimes you cannot capture one word in the original language, in the other, or in the target language. And as a result, you've got to explain what is meant by the word in the target language. So there are these differences that one has to bear in mind. So the issue of translation goes along with it, but there's also a degree of interpretation that also accompanies it. And these are issues that one has to bear in mind. Now, the names of these manuscripts that we have here listed, these are just some, by the way, we haven't listed them all. Let's go to our right. These are what we call common manuscripts. There are more than 2 at the Cape. Al-Barahin. Now, I come back to this one because I sort of try to explain this one a bit more. Bidayat al-Mubtadi by Sheikh Muhammad Saleh al-Rawa, according to one interpretation. Then there's another interpretation saying, no, it is by al-Banjari. So there are different of opinion as to basically who the author of this particular text was. But be that as it may, there are copies to be found, more than 2 at the Cape. As-Sirat al-Mustaqim, there's also 3, if I'm not mistaken, of this text here. Then there's Kifayat al-Muhtaj by Sheikh Dawood ibn Abdullah al-Fatani. Then there is al-Banjari's text, Tuhfat al-Raghibin. And one of the interesting texts, we have more than 9 copies, if not 10. There might be more than that, but from what had been listed in the catalogs, is Hukum al-Aqli. Now, Hukum al-Aqli is, in fact, taken from al-Barahin by As-Sanusi. And Hukum al-Aqli seems to be a popular text that have been moving around in the hands of the Cape Muslims. Those where we just seem to have 1 copy from, according to the current study, is that Akhbar al-Khayrat of Araniri, Kashf al-Ghimma, and then Masail al-Mubtadi, and Dala'il al-Khayrat, and of course, Bustan al-Salatin that we had mentioned earlier on. Now, the point we want to make, whilst all of them are unique, despite the fact that there are more than 1, because important, and I'll come to examples of that, of Hukuk al-Aqli, that why each manuscript is unique on its own, but what is of importance here is that if there's only 1, you cannot compare it with any other, and that makes it a very rare text at the Cape. One can perhaps compare, say, with those manuscripts back in Southeast Asia, or maybe in Southwest Asia. That is, when we talk about Southwest Asia, we talk about Arabia and Yemen and so forth. But I think it's important to bear in mind. May quickly just give you an example of some of the manuscripts here too. I've tried to just list some of them in terms of dates. We'll come back to Sifadu Apulu. We have Hukm al-Aqli, for example. We have manuscript that is dated 1809. Now, two questions, or of course more than that, but 2 or 3 questions that one has to ask. Was this manuscript copied in 1809, or did it land here in 1809? That is, when you say here, I mean Cape. So in other words, you have questions that is difficult to answer, but we'll have to sort of move back into history, find ways of trying to prove that, for example, it is a manuscript that was copied here or copied elsewhere, but in 1809 and found its way to the Cape. Idah al-Bab, it's a longer sort of title. There are 2 copies. And by the way, the 4th column are the owners or the collectors. The one is Haji Hussein, for example. Then the other one, NH, is Nur Haywood. Then there is Muhammad Lutfi Ibrahim. Some spell the I with the E, so Ibrahim. And then there's Dr. Qasim Dasi. I just use some of them There are others, of course, but I just wanted to give you an idea of the collectors, but more specifically the dates, so that we can see that the sort of 19th century period, we're talking about the late 18th century, early 19th century, that there were a plethora of manuscripts at the Cape, and these were critical for the transformation, intellectual transformation of the Muslim leadership. So you have that as 1809, you have Kifayatul Muhtaj, 1809, you have there's a copy of Barahin in 1823, and so forth. So in other words, and of course, Tukhfa al-Raghibin, we find two dates. One, of course, one assumed the 1779 was when it was penned, but 1870 is a copy of that, and so forth. So one can go through each of the others and basically sort of comment on those. The second column are the folios, the pages. I don't like to use the word pages; it comes from the word manuscript. So we talk about folios. For example, Hukum Akli, there are a number of copies, as we had said, we just use samples. 34, the one has 34, the one has 41, the one has 76, the one has 128. And this could be because of the number of lines per folio. So in some cases spread out, in some cases it's written very tersely and very tightly. So yeah, there's variation. So, but what we see here, Sayra Salikin, for example, is quite a tome. And again, it'll be great for some scholars who will have the opportunity to look at them and to try to study them in terms of the history, in terms of the content, in terms of, and comparing to others. If there's no other copy at the Cape, then of course one will have to go back. Like in the case of Kashrul Ghimma, there's only one copy. So one has to compare it with those elsewhere. Let me now come and give you specific examples. Sanusi's Barahin is indeed one of the critical works that influence, and Ahmad Davids and Professor Uwais Rafuddin have been exploring the Sanusi ideas at the Cape in their own sort of way. So their contributions have to be taken into account when one looks at sort of this development. Interestingly, very recently, 2 or 3 years ago, I think Che, I'm trying to get to the person's name, scholar from Malaysia, who also did a study on Barahin. Again, from there, one was able to also gauge some of the impact it had even at the Cape, though he does not talk about the Cape, but the importance of this particular work. The point which we make on our left is that this was a North African scholar. It moved across North African desert, so to speak, moved to South, West Asia, that is finding its way to Mecca and Medina, and then from there moving to South Asia and to Southeast Asia. So it traveled a long distance in terms of its contents, in terms of its ideas, and of course the impact has been lasting. We ourselves, to this day, have learned from the Sanusi's text, and we'll come back to the subtext that we'll sort of come to in a moment. Now, these are the subtexts that we were able to gauge from what other scholars have been saying. That when you look at Barahin as the mother text, it had the subtext. Hukum al-Aqli is one of them. Bidayat al-Mubtadi is yet another. Sifat Duwapula is yet another. And then Atiyat al-Rahman is yet another piece. And of course, we try to describe each one of these in the last column there. Atiyat al-Rahman, for example, there's no other copy except this copy is one of in the hand of one of the collectors. That makes it also extremely unique. As we had said, Hukum Aqli, there are 9 to 10 such copies around. Bidayat al-Mubtadi, a limited number. And then Sifat Duwapula, there are maybe 4 or 5 to be found. And we'll sort of come back to these, to Hukum al-Aqli and Sifat Duwapula in a moment. I just sort of use this just to share with us the the beautiful writing, of course, but also the manuscript itself, very clear from Snoek Chronius collection, just to give us some idea of the text that we are talking about, not the printed one, but the manuscript itself. The other point I just want to highlight is the fact of the point which we, in a sense, shared with you a moment ago, the traveling dimension of the manuscript. Sanusi wrote it in the 15th century. It found its way in the 16th and 17th century to, of course, from Tlemcen or Tilmisan to Makkah, Medina. Then, in turn, it found its way into the Malay archipelago, South Asia, and of course, eventually, by the 18th, 19th century also, it landed up at the Cape, of all places. And of course, some say even along east coast of Africa in the Makua speaking community and elsewhere, because Sanusi's impact seemed to have been so deep and so dense that all of these communities, all our communities were in one way or another affected and influenced by his ideas. And we'll come to one of these in a moment. And this is basically this particular text. Al-Barahin, it's Sifa 20 text. Now, when we were, this personalizes, when we were at madrasa in the 1960s, we were all told to learn what we say in Afrikaans, 20 sifat, the 20 attributes, which is this Sifa 20. And this is a popular subject of Malay text and of course popular at the Cape too, forming an essential part of Muslim theological teaching. So we were all brought up to focus our minds on these 20 attributes of the Almighty. And in this way, we have been convinced about the attributes and about who God is and about understanding God as our creator. So it really impacted on our psyche. And of course, this filtered down to the communities as such. And in this way, it stands out to this day. Many different compositions on God's attributes, both lengthy and abbreviated, that are written in both prose and verse, are to be found. And of course, we encountered that here in the Cape. We mentioned earlier on Akhbar al-Akhirah, Rani's illuminated manuscript, that these photos that you see here, this copy is to be found here at the Cape. And this is also found in Munazza's catalog. Other two that were found, Sayr Salikin and Hikayat Nabi Buchukur, basically is also texts that are basically, and Hikayat Nabi Buchukur basically this is the only copy. There's no other copy to be found at the Cape. But let me come to 2 or 3 other examples as we move towards the end. Malay manuscripted text, the Ayat 15. Now, the 15 verses, as we all know, these verses possess extraordinary properties that can make it easier for one to achieve the desires that one wants, and so forth. In other words, there are specially selected ayat that individuals are encouraged to read and to repeat and so forth for different reasons, whether for healing purposes or whatever, but they have become very popular. And this is one sample that we have here to get. As you can see from the title, it's in Malayu, it's not in Arabic Afrikaans, and that of course makes the difference. And this belongs to that unique set of manuscript. Again, we're not going to go to each of these, but I think these slides just give us a taste of what these set of manuscripts are all about. These are all the verses that are contained in that set, from Al-Imran to Al-An'am to Takwir and Abasa and so forth. And so we can sort of look at that. But let me come to the text, Sifa 20, that was extracted from Al-Barahin. We basically, of course, these are samples from elsewhere, and I think anyone who goes to the Asian African Studies blog at SOAS will find an interesting set. At the British Library, will find an interesting sort of material there for on manuscripts. Quickly, just on Hukum al-Aqli, of course, Hukum al-Aqli basically is, of course, in terms of its theme, is compared to, say, how does it differ from hukum adi or adat or hukum shar'i. So there are these variations. But I want to come to the samples that we have. As you can see, there are two different samples here. The one basically is in the hands of Nur Haywood, another in the hands of another collector or owner. And so, as you can see from these examples, the handwriting is different. So they are therefore different. So anybody who, of course, who knows Bahasa well, classical Bahasa, so to speak, can compare these and produce an interesting study. Because unfortunately, and this is the point which I want to make, that many of us don't know Bahasa, and therefore we need to cooperate with scholars from South Asia to pursue these particular areas and to produce some interesting studies. This is just a sample from the previous one, where the folio 1 and folio 2 is shared. And this is Nur Haywood's collection. He has a different copy, as we can see from if one compares this one to the previous two that we basically showed. And then we want to quickly come to another Muqaddimat al-Mubtadi. Unfortunately, I was unable to really find the author as such, although because there is the Muqaddimat al-Mubtadi, and then of course there's Bidayat al-Mubtadi. So there are these various manuscripts that we have here, and of course whether they are exactly the same and whether it is one attribute to Sheikh Baba Dawood Arumi, of course these are all need to be explored, but I think they are important to bear in mind. Let me come to Arabic Afrikaans as we move towards the closure. We mentioned this early on, that in 1850s, it was discovered, it was found that this particular manuscript was making its rounds as a lithographic text. I have a copy of it also with me, but there are others also of lithographic text, but not in the original manuscript form as such. However, the point which you want to make with this, as you can, if those of us who try to read what is here, will find that they wouldn't be able to make out unless they know Afrikaans, because it's written in Afrikaans. And so this particular text is an indication that at that point, we're talking about the 1850s, there's been a gradual shift from using copiously Malayu to the use of Afrikaans. So Afrikaans now become the dominant language within the community as such. This is another, this is the sort of the first folio of that particular text. Again, if we try to read, of course, the basmala, and then you'll find that it starts off with Afrikaans. Moet men jammer leke genadige Allah, and so forth. All right, so I'm reading Afrikaans because that's what that's a language that has been used, but in the Arabic script. Now, just quickly on sort of the whole genre of Arabic Afrikaans, that text known as Al-Qawl Mateen, as you can see the transliteration here in the first one, Gablul Matim, Gablul Malin. Of course, these were taken from earlier individuals who've been writing about this, who were unable to really decipher the transliterated sort of words. The person who did the lithographic work was Johan Soggengevel, and of course we have a translation of this in Arabic Afrikaans in 1910, Afrikaans as such, and we have people like Sheikh Abu Bakr ibn Abdullah Abdraouf, who basically had a copy of these, or to whom this was attributed. The person who did the study of Arabic Afrikaans, we already introduced you to him early on, that is Adrianus van Selms of 1953, and then Subsequently, very interestingly, about this very text, Professor Weiss and Ahmad Davis entered into a debate as to the authenticity of this particular work. And of course, we're not going to go into that, but the very interesting debate that took place then. And of course, Ahmad's understanding of the community and the use of the language in the Arabic script basically shed some new light onto the evolution in terms of the language of the Muslim community. These are just samples of Arabic Afrikaans words. Unfortunately, they're very small, but I just wanted to share this with you, but more in transliteration form. We find that the community, of course, of late, there has been what we call a process of Arabization. People have become more Arabic conscious, so to speak, in terms of the word usage. Instead of saying tramakasi, we say shukran. Or instead of saying tulis, of course, we now use the English word right and so forth. Puasa, we still sort of, our generation and earlier ones still use. The word jambang has now slowly moved out. The word kali used to be used. That's also slowly disappearing. The word lambar, to be engaged for marriage, is also used. The word mantra for azimat was also used. And of course, the word miang, incense sticks, are still very much used in some. So these are interesting examples again, and we have other lexical structures that we want. For example, Krislam, convey salam, Tuan Kubur, a grave digger, khutbah, he gave a sermon, or khasalat, he performed salah, sumbayang, and abdas plek, place of wudu, bukatate, time to break fast, and so forth. This is just a list by Qudsi, and I'm not going to go into that. But this is a text of Abu Bakr Effendi's Bayanuddin. The first 2 pages, I say pages because it was printed in Istanbul, again, giving an understanding of Islam. And of course, he was a Hanafi trained scholar. And of course, it is important to also take that into account theologically, because most of the Cape Muslims, one can still say, are Shafis. Of course, they are Malikis now, they are Hanbalis, and others, but the dominant school is the Shafi school. So with his intervention, it brought the Hanafi more into prominence, and we're not going to go into that. The other sort of texts that are around, like Kitab al-Ilm al-Faraid, Masail Abi Layth al-Samarkandi, and Al-Muqaddimah al-Hadramiya by Sheikh Ismail Hanif, who basically wrote this in 1928. He only died in 1958, and he wrote Arabic Afrikaans texts almost up to the period he had passed away. These are 2 samples, cover samples of 2 texts, the one by Sheikh Ismail, whom we just mentioned. As we can see, Al-Ma'raj Al-Qawim, and then we have Su'al wa Jawab by Sheikh Ahmad Bihadin, who was also one of the prominent shuyukh at the Cape. Just to round off, we talk about mushafs. There's 1 or 2 such mushafs around. I haven't been able to see them as such. So one needs to sort of have a look at them to see whether they associated with the tafsir text that we mentioned early on, or whether it's a totally different one. So we need to sort of explore those. But important to bear in mind that at the Cape, people like Tuan Guru, or also known as Imam Abdullah, wrote from memory a copy of the Quran. So there are extant ones, 3 of them, as far as I understand, and one of them are in the hands of the family, the descendants of Tuan Guru, and it is indeed an important copy that is around. Interestingly, at the end of this particular copy, it is in Bahasa, as you can, for those of us who, of course, are able to read it, we can see that the scholar, the person who basically did this project, basically was familiar with the language as such, and thus ended. Just to basically end then, the Afrikaans Language Museum was set up in Paarl, and this was partly to celebrate the Afrikaans language. Ahmed David was the one who argued in the late 1990s that this particular monument should not have been in Paarl, but should have been in the Boerkamp. And this is because of the contributions that the Cape Muslim have made towards the Afrikaans language without the Afrikaners knowing that another community was basically using the language in an active way and writing it using the Arabic script. And in that way, of course, made their mark. What are we saying with this particular presentation? We say that another effort must be made to locate all of these manuscripts in whichever way possible. The next step is to digitize whatever manuscript we find, so at least we have digitized copies. We have to update and amend and correct catalogs that have been published, like the two that we have, or even articles that appear that were incorrect, because in some cases there were articles that were written that catalog some of these, but they were incorrect sort of points that were basically made. We should encourage families to have their set of manuscripts stored in libraries, particularly state library, support students, researchers to basically study these, to chronologize these manuscripts. Now, we've tried to do that in our small way, not necessarily successfully, but it's a way of giving us a sense that when we talk about the 18th century period into the 19th century, that there has been lots of these manuscripts circulating, and their circulation meant that there was an intellectual vibrancy of sorts, theologically or from a fiqh side. So in that way, it stirred the minds of those who basically were able to read this text, were able to learn this text, were able to circulate this text. So they're important. As scholars, we need to examine these manuscripts from various dimensions to offer a broad understanding of the contents and the contribution. We need to check if there are additional copies with which to compare. Like we said, Hukum al-Aqli, we have a number of them. So one will have to sit down, compare the sort of these particular texts, see how they differ, where they differ in terms of words, in terms of sentences, in terms of translation, in terms of misinterpretation, whatever. But I think that becomes a fascinating area. But all of these contribute towards understanding this early Cape Muslim community. Check if there are additional copies elsewhere. Produce a critical edited edition, something that we mentioned earlier on, accompanied by a translation and commentary. These should appear both in English and Bahasa. And then, of course, we need to cooperate. We need to really work together as academics because after all, we might lack in certain areas, but the other person who works in this cooperative project might have those skills. And in this way, we can work together to produce something that belongs to us all and not just to one particular community. Because when you look at the influence is from outside in, and it is within this community where this transformation has taken place, intellectual, theological, fiqh sort of transformation that I think even our community is not very familiar with and needs to be spoken about and shared with. Terima kasih to ISTAC for this opportunity. And in Kosi, Taki, Shukran, thank you. We end our presentation there.
Thank you very much to Prof. Muhammad Haron for the very interesting and illuminating lecture on Malay manuscripts in South Africa. Because it is interesting to know that even in South Africa, there are Malay manuscripts there. To the extent, if I'm not mistaken, written there were more than 100 titles of Malay manuscripts. So now we open, we come to the question and answer session. Yeah, okay. Prof. Osman would like to ask a question. Please, yes.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Wan. I would like to, first of all, to thank Brother Professor Muhammad Haron for your presentation. It's a very, very informative information. I come to learn quite a good number of things. And of course, secondly, also to thank you, to congratulate you for the very important work you have been doing regarding the manuscripts, the Malay manuscripts in South Africa. Not only the manuscripts per se, but many, many other issues related to those manuscripts. I remember when I went to Cape Town in 1994 to celebrate 300 years of the arrival of Sheikh Yusuf Makassar. I met Ham, Brother Ahmad David, whose photo you showed. And he told me at the time, I mean, he says he has written a master's thesis already about the African language being written in Jawi. All right. And he also talked about many, many Malay words which entered into Afrikaan. But at the time, the thesis was not yet. Well, I don't know, has that been published? That because I was interested at the time, I was at the University of Malaya at the time. So when I came back from Cape Town from that visit, I took initiative, to ask the Language Center of the University of Malaya to undertake a few things. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. I already got the money allocation. I got the person, one lady, a scholar to go there, but that didn't materialize for some reason. So I don't know whether there's been any development along that line. First of all, we need to publish that. Maybe it has been published already. If not, we should, I think. And I think maybe ISTAC can try to first of all, right? Has it been published, Prof?
Yeah. In fact, that photo I showed you earlier on.
Oh, I see.
So that was basically his thesis that was turned into a book.
All right.
So at least
Brother Azman, I see in the library. I think we should get a copy of the book in our library.
Inshallah. Yes. Inshallah.
Yeah, inshallah. All right. Now regarding the what I call this, the issues that followed up, or rather mentioned by Dr. Wan, I just want to follow up on those things. I think I agree. We should push this project of digitalization of the Malay manuscript in South Africa. I think based on our past experience when dealing with manuscripts owned by families, I think the attitudes of the families are not monolithic in the sense they have different attitudes. Some given the right amount of money, they will sell. But of course, which means that we have to pay some money. Number two, yes, maybe some, they say they do not want to, for sentimental reason, maybe more that, they do not want to depart from those manuscripts, but they may be prepared, say, for a little amount of money to allow us to digitalize. I think that's something that we need to look at. So I think this ISTAC should take up this with the library and pursue this thing. And the other one, of course, I'm support of the idea of Professor Muhammad Haron himself, to somehow to arrange for him to undertake some project at ISTAC is something that we have to discuss at the management level ISTAC. Yeah, as I see, yes, I mean another thing. All this while, when talking about the Malay caves, we know also there are Malays, small Malay community, Malay Indonesian community in Suriname. Have you, in terms of literary link, is there any link between Malay cave and the Malay in Suriname in Latin America? I think for the time being,
There's no. Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. Yeah, just on that score, no, there's no link. Although there is familiarity with these, particularly via Holland, because some of us who had gone to Holland realized that there were those who were in Suriname. So in that way, but there's no sort of social interconnection of sorts in any way, unfortunately. But I suppose that can be explored in different ways. But just coming back to the point you made, yes, I think the issue of monetary, if we put a monetary value on a manuscript A or B or C, of course, sometimes that value might not be able to really capture the value. But be that as it may, it's a way of maybe attracting an interest to saying, look, why not part with it? Because we will put in a library, we'll care for it, it will be there for generations to come. And in that way, but I think these communities, these families need hard convincing. In other words, you really have to be a good negotiator and arbitrator of sorts to tell them, look here, these are valuable pieces of text that you have in your family, and they can disappear. And unfortunately, sadly, some have disappeared as we talk. I mean, this has now been for 2, 3, 4 decades, and this has been the concern. I mean, we're talking now 2, 3 decades down the line since Munaza's text almost. And the second one has also come out by Dr. Payeni. And the issue is, when is there going to be a concerted effort made to really secure these? And even our local government hasn't succeeded. Mm-hmm. So maybe we'll have to just seriously think about these, and as you suggest, maybe to see how we can proceed with the various ideas on the table.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you.